everything I did from qualification and for the first 10 years can literally be done by a AI large language model. Law is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And it's a skill how we develop, how we analyse our problems, how we solve problems. And this can, to a certain extent now, be undertaken by a chatbot.
We're back, another episode of the Bidzi Way podcast, and today we are very, very fortunate to have Patrik Daintry, who is a partner at CMS MENA, one of the largest law firms in the world, and in fact partners of Bidzi. So Patrik, welcome to the Bidzi Way podcast.
Thanks very much, guys. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being here.
So Patrik, just a brief introduction. You and I have known each other for probably longer than either of us choose to recall, but can you just share a little bit about yourself and what brought you to the region and what you're doing here right now?
Yeah, sure. So actually, as you know, I came out of the region in 2006 on about a year's secondment, which turned into a life sentence. I was never expecting to remain in the region such a long time, but I was attracted by its dynamic growth opportunities, its sort of frontier vision back in 2006, and I still have the same strong feelings today. It's a fantastic place to be and work, and an exciting place to be and work.
Nice.
But I suppose my journey started in 2006 with Norton Rose, and Akshay and myself. We shared an office together, and we had some good times.
In a villa in Abu Dhabi.
In a villa.
With an ensuite bathroom.
Which you could actually sneak off and have a power nap in. And
nice.
Quite a few people did. The bathtub was a perfect size for one horizontal body. But that changed after a while. I think we were there for about 2 years before we moved into another office down in Silla Tower on the ADGM. But before that, I actually moved on to another law firm. So I was working for about 10 years for big American white shoe firms, as they say, and enjoyed my time there. And that sort of brought me full circle back to a international platform such as CMS. You know, we are a firm with roughly 1,200 partners globally, about 5,000 fee earners, and a total staff of about 9,000. And we are located in about 70 offices in about 45 countries. I probably have the numbers wrong. Every day there's a new firm joining our collaboration. But I think the crux of it is we are a growing law firm, one of the biggest in the world, and we do spread ourselves in all the key jurisdictions globally.
I want to touch on this point, Patrik, so I think this is important. And in fact, although you and I share a long relationship, friendship, what most people don't know is that CMS have supported Bidzi when we were setting up, and specifically in terms of all our legal documentation that's on the platform, something that we're very proud of, certainly gives us a lot of comfort that you guys have looked at it. Can you tell us a little more about the Equip program, which is something that you do to really support smaller startups and SMEs?
Yeah, of course, actually. Look, Equip is a brainchild, I suppose, of our London office, and we saw a huge gap in the market in terms of all of the budding startups which were popping up around globally in the tech sphere, in the sort of traditional SME space as well, but didn't really have the sort of financial clout to get quality legal advice. And getting quality legal advice from the start is a real bonus when it comes to structuring your business or structuring a business. And we just saw a gap in the market there. So to try and encourage and try and help our startup clients, we developed Equip, And Equip basically is a startup platform where we're able to subsidize the legal fees we offer our clients. It's not a platform anyone applies, anyone gets in. We do screen our new clients thoroughly, and we want to believe, and we share the vision that they're going to be very successful, and thereby getting subsidized rates on our extortionate hourly rates for a startup, but very, very reasonable for an institution like the ones you see down in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. So let's put that as a caveat. And then we also are able to offer additional discounts on invoicing as well. And the bonus is that as a Equip member, you get the access of the CMS platform, and that allows you to operate and get advice in any country within the jurisdiction. Right. And partners and fee earners and associates in these jurisdictions are very happy to pick up the telephone or peck away at a computer, because they know they are also being credited for the time they're putting into the business.
And you know what? We'll share your email address at the end of the podcast, so that any other entrepreneurs and startups that feel that they'd benefit from the Equip program can reach out to you. So you may well be inundated after this, Patrik.
Sounds good. I look forward to getting all of the requests.
Perfect.
So I just want to talk a little bit about, the SME infrastructure out here in the Middle East, in Dubai in particular. SMEs are really the lifeblood of any economy, and in particular this economy. I think they represent something like 90% of all businesses.
That's correct, yeah.
About 64% of non-oil GDP. So a massive, the heartbeat of the economy, really. Now, are there, certain things that, if you're looking at buying or selling an SME, any common pitfalls that you see either buyer or seller sort of falling into from a legal perspective?
I think, like any transaction, preparation is key. And I think sometimes our clients, and particularly the ones which are not used to doing M&A transactions, such as SMEs, think that everything can happen in a heartbeat. So I would just sort of caution both buyer and seller to sort of step back and put together a schedule, a plan, a timescale, with the support potentially of a legal provider right from the start, in order to manage everyone's expectations, so that buyers and sellers not committing to timelines and timetables which just can't be implemented. So preparation is definitely key.
So Patrik, I'm not a lawyer, right? And for me...
Are you not?
Oh, no, not yet.
Because you seem to have a larger legal brain than your co-worker.
Thank you for the compliment.
The protege.
Protege. Under the tutelage of Lord Akshay. But, to the folks who are watching this today, right? What are the steps or the key steps that anyone has to undertake in a typical M&A transaction? What are those steps that cannot be left behind to ensure the successful completion of a transaction?
Okay, well, to answer that question, let's just talk generically, buyer and seller and their perspective.
Sure.
So you basically have what we call pre-transaction document stage, where the buyer and seller will typically agree some of the pre-transaction documents. These could be, for example, exclusivity agreements, where the seller promises to be exclusive for a period of time to allow the transaction to proceed, and the buyer taking that risk to move forward. You usually have a confidentiality agreement as well, because there'll be a lot of information transferring between buyer and seller. And what you'll often see is a letter of intent being sent by the buyer to the seller, setting out the conditions and the sort of structuring terms which the buyer sees and how to affect the transaction. At that stage in the process, the buyer won't have done too much diligencing yet, so the level of detail in the LOI might be very limited. It might be as short and sharp and sweet as saying we want to acquire your business and let's have further discussions. Or if they've had some more information, that LOI can be quite detailed. Once the pre-transaction documents are signed off, then you go to the diligence stage, the legal due diligence, the financial due diligence, and usually the commercial due diligence in the transaction process. That's typically led by the buyer's lawyers, sending a questionnaire to the sellers or the seller's lawyers, setting out all the questions they need to have visibility on in order to effectively draft the transaction documents further down the line. So once the legal due diligence is finished, then you get into the transaction negotiation stage, where buyer and seller will start batting what we call a share purchase agreement, an SPA for short, between themselves. And the information contained in the SPA will be all of the risks the buyer has uncovered during the diligence process. And once that's incorporated into the SPA, that's back and forwards, usually then have an exercise called a disclosure exercise, supported by a disclosure letter, which forms part of the SPA, where certain of the warranties contained in the SPA, and I'm getting a little bit technical now, sorry for that, certain of the warranties in the SPA are disclosed against. Okay. Now, what that means in practice is the SPA will have a number of warranties with respect to accounts, the status of the business, the shares in the business, etc. And they are statements of fact. Now, if the seller decides that certain of those statements they're true, but there are slight discretions from them, that's when the seller will disclose against them in the disclosure letter. So once that process is finalised, you'll have a disclosure letter and an SPA which gets signed on the same day.
Okay.
And that's the transaction stage. And then what you usually have is after the transaction, you have after the execution of the transaction documents, because you generally have a period of time between signing the document and closing the transaction. There's a period of time when the company and the seller, when I say the company, the target, is getting its house in order, ready for the sale, and certain conditions for the sale might be undertaken by the sellers in order to effect the share transfer. And that will happen anywhere between a week to 2 months to 3 months after signing the SPA. And that's typically a transaction timetable for you.
So letter of intent, due diligence, SPA, disclosure letter, and then the final share transfer.
Correct.
All right.
And these are all the documents which we developed together for the Bidzi platform,
right.
which pretty much duplicates exactly what a multi-billion-dollar sale of a business and how it's structured can also be replicated for an SME.
So it doesn't matter the size of the business. These are the best practices in terms of which documents to use in ensuring a successful completion of a sale.
Correct.
Perfect.
Interestingly, one of the things I'd quite like to sort of bring forth here is that it doesn't matter if it's a $10 million transaction or a $100 million transaction or a $300 million transaction. The time it takes to implement a transaction, regardless of value, is quite similar.
Okay.
And that's why some of our clients sometimes question our invoices and our fee estimates, because they say, well, it's only a $10 million transaction. But lawyers, we work on an hourly rate. We try and cap those hourly rates depending on the task in hand. But we're still throwing bodies and time at a task. So a $10 million transaction versus a $50 million transaction usually takes the same sort of resources. Being very generalistic here, but that's just a bit of an explanation.
Got it. So the legal fees and legal resources is not directly proportional to the value of the transaction. Got it.
Unlike the investment bankers who take a percentage of
Yeah.
Right.
the deal value, us lawyers, we generally take and charge by the hour, and that's how we commercialize our business.
Got it.
There's quite a... So firstly, thanks for articulating the process as beautifully as you have, Patrik. And I've been shooting these podcast videos for a while, and I keep going up and down. And I think from now on, we're just going to put your face on top of all of these. I'm sure the female viewership will go through the roof.
As I stroke my long blonde hair.
But, you raised a number of interesting points as you went through, and I want to pick on some of those. We'll come to the fees and how lawyers bill in a moment. But one thing that Asif and I have seen in a number of the transactions, which we've structured as per your and your team's advice in exactly that way, in the letter of intent, we are seeing sellers pushing and wanting some form of non-refundable deposit. And Asif and I have taken time to try to explain that, of course, it's completely their prerogative to try and ask, but it's typically not market for a buyer to give that. Now, would that be what you're seeing as well, or do you think...
Certainly. I've got to be completely honest with you. I don't think I've ever seen any seller in a sophisticated transaction get away with requesting a upfront fee for the purposes of starting the transaction process. What we do sometimes see are break fees, which could potentially be similar to what you're sort of referring to now. But that's generally from the buyer's perspective, and the buyer will be spending a considerable amount of time and resource diligencing and getting a transaction ready for execution. And sometimes it will want the seller to sort of stand behind the transaction by providing exclusivity, which we discussed earlier. And where the seller decides during that period of time, the exclusive period of time, if he were to break that exclusivity for any reason, then the buyer sometimes is able to negotiate in sort of recourse by a break fee payment.
Got it.
Due to the fact of the seller breaching its
Terms.
promise for exclusivity. This has cost the buyer time and money, and arguably has a pretty fair claim for compensation.
So it's good to know that that's certainly what we're seeing, and that's the same that's happening in the large deals. How do you get your sellers comfortable that... So the LOI is almost always non-binding. A bad-intentioned buyer, and this comes to us again, sellers are concerned that a bad-intentioned buyer is going to come in, look under the hood of the business, understand a lot of secrets. It's post-LOI. Run a due diligence process with no intention of closing the transaction, and then understanding all the business secrets and everything about the seller's business. And that's a very real concern. I think it is more of a concern for smaller businesses than perhaps some of the larger multinational transactions that you're typically dealing with. But how does a seller get comfortable, or what can the seller do to protect against this?
Yeah, I think this is the seller conundrum, and it will happen in every single transaction. The seller is always going to be slightly suspicious that a competitor is using this as an opportunity to go shopping for information.
Right.
So ways in which we try and mitigate that risk, there are a few. You've got the contractual route, which is having a robust NDA/confidentiality agreement. There's also the protection you get under law for using other people's information for dubious purposes. So under the UE penal law, and I've got to make sure that I'm getting all this correct.
Disclosure of company secrets and stuff.
Company secrets and trade secrets and prohibitions against exploiting those. But ultimately, contractually, it's always going to be a difficult difficult issue for the seller to try and claim against.
And I suppose evidentially as well, right? Like proving that someone's used your information, very, very tough.
Correct. So
the thing is, we see a lot of trading businesses in the UAE, right, which are dependent on distributorships, right, and those can be easily stolen by competitors that are looking under the hood. So what sort of recourse do they have if a deal doesn't go through? Because now the potential acquirer has taken away all that information and is reaching out to these distributors and trying to get that relationship for this market.
Yeah, look, it's a very, very real concern. The only thing which we've tended to do when there's very sensitive information in a data room, we might tackle it in two ways. At the beginning stages, we might very easily redact lots of price sensitive information and commercial information. And here it is mainly proving, we have a key customer. It is X and the term is for Y and the consideration is blobbed, for example. And then the further along the diligence comes and the seller is actually feeling more comfortable that this is a bona fide purchaser, then information will be drip fed. And allowing everyone to get an understanding, or allowing the buyer to get an understanding of the business. But there is actually very little you can do against a bad actor, apart from what I mentioned earlier in terms of putting all the contractual documentation into place, the NDAs and the like.
Got it. But that's a good strategy, drip fed. Right?
Drip feeding,
Just releasing little by little until you're comfortable with the intentions of the buyer.
Correct. Purchasers do not like that. But
of course.
It comes to a sort of old school saying, you should never do business with someone you don't like. And that's right from the start. So if from the start you have gut feelings and suspicions that the person or the company you're dealing with hasn't got good intentions, just walk away.
Got it.
Because if you don't trust your counterparty, which you're going to be in discussions with for the next couple of months from day one, then my view, walk away, because it will probably do you more harm than good.
Got it.
Patrik, you talked about the due diligence process, obviously one of the most important processes, certainly from a buyer's perspective. Any common red flags that you've seen or that you would recommend that buyers and buyers' lawyers look out for? And I say buyers' lawyers here because one thing we see a lot of, unfortunately, is the access to good quality legal advice isn't that readily available here in the UAE. And that certainly for the SME sector is because there's such a gap between the quality that you get at your level, which is not always affordable to certainly smaller businesses, versus what you're getting with one man and a laptop. So what sort of things would you or have you seen that are real red flags in buy-side due diligence that they should be aware of?
One of the areas which we like to home in on is the actual structure of the corporate. And the structure of the corporate, in my mind, and we're talking about the target here, is how do the constitutional documents look vis-a-vis a shareholders agreement, if there are any? Is the corporate up to date with its various licenses? If it's a mainland entity, we'll be looking at the DED to making sure that the license is up to date. If it's a free zone entity, you'll be doing the same thing, but with the free zone regulator. And often these are the areas, if there are any issues here, you're most certainly going to see issues in the rest of the documentation which the company is disclosing. That for me is always, as a corporate lawyer, the first place to start, particularly because you're going to be selling shares in that entity. What we've also seen in the past is documents being uploaded where, for example, they've got audited accounts for the last, say, 3 years up until 2021, and then all of a sudden there's just a blank. There's 22 doesn't exist, and 23 doesn't exist. And then you ask, where are these financials? And then they will respond by saying, we haven't drawn them up yet. And that's also a red flag, because, and one which I think SMEs will certainly be privy to quite often.
We see that. In fact, on the financial side, we see it quite a lot. One sort of comfort that we do give, and in fact we suggest to all buyers, whether audited financials are available or not, is that, look, take audited with a pinch of salt. Mm-hmm. They're done on a trial basis, like a sample basis, sorry. The diligence that a good accountant will do for a buyer by checking point of sales, cash flow statements, credit card, bank accounts, that will be far more granular and detailed than any audit would be. So we always recommend that. Now, that's very much more on the SME side. Of course, if you've got a tens or hundreds of millions of dollar business, not always doable. And then I know there's certain comfort that comes from the fact that one of the large audit firms have stamped off.
That is a good point. Do your financial diligence and get your financial, hopefully, advisor to assist with the diligence of your or the target's accounts. Another area which I've seen as well, which has raised flags, is in the sort of projections of a target's business revenues in the future, and also the projections of maybe the current financial year. There always seems to be a huge sort of valuation gap between what the seller hopes to sell his business for and what the buyer is prepared to pay for his business. And that usually gets unpicked or picked apart during the diligence process, where all of a sudden the expectations of the sellers are a bit more grounded once the buyer has pinpointed certain discrepancies, one can say, in the data.
Well, this is the seller's best friend. Discounted cash flow modeling enters the chat.
And hope. Oh, we've seen projections where a company's been losing money year over year, and then suddenly next year they're going to make 30% EBITDA margins, and then it's going to keep growing for the next 3 years, just when they've sold the company.
Exactly.
So, we see a lot of those red flags also.
Yeah, we do. And Asif and I have discussed this many times. And look, it's a delicate but a vital conversation. And our jobs, certainly, in fact, all of us in the kind of professional services sort of segment, is to guide sellers and bring them closer to the reality, because there's no point in them going through the time, in some cases money, effort to get to a certain point if their expectations are completely out of sync with what market norms are.
Yeah, correct.
And there is an element of great entrepreneurs being dreamers, being visionaries. You have to be, right? You have to be a little bit crazy to make it work, because it's so hard. But yeah, we've seen some valuations at probably higher multiples than even OpenAI or Tesla. But here's to hoping.
Here's to hoping.
Sure. Another sort of giveaway is when in the legal diligence you start unpicking and unlocking the key customer contracts of that business, and you see that the customer contracts don't really equate to what the sell price is coming in at. So there's, again, a huge sort of discrepancy and a gap. And that's always quite interesting when you sort of do the maths, and even as a lawyer, you see that, this doesn't work. There's like $10 million on the table here, but the company's being sold at 200 million. And that's a pretty crazy multiple for a industrial. Yeah. So how does that work?
Look, that's the game we play, I suppose. We have to educate and hope that people take that on board. I want to talk about a document that we, in certainly the SME space, hardly ever see. And I think this comes back to my earlier point of the quality of legal advice out there for SMEs. The disclosure letter. Now, you talked about that. You and I will know that that's vital. Am I right? That phrase, a sword or a shield, can a disclosure letter be used as a sword and a shield? Right?
Yeah, I see it a little bit as both, but mainly as the shield.
I'd love to.
Protecting the seller.
Can you talk about this? Because I know this is something that most, if not all, of our sellers, even the more sophisticated ones, have just not come across.
Yeah.
A small but vital document. If you can just explain it a bit more.
Can you just remind me, where did we get to on the Bidzi platform with the
So
disclosure
in
letter?
ours, we have a disclosure letter built in as a concept. It's scheduled to the document if one gets that far in the SPA, but it needs to be populated. There are certain, obviously, general disclosures, which are whatever's in the data room. I think that's the main one, the classic, whatever's in the public domain. But the specific disclosures are obviously bespoke to every transaction. So we've got a templated sort of skeleton in place, which is already further along than 90% of SME deals. They won't even have a disclosure letter as a concept.
Okay, no, that makes sense. So look, on a larger transaction, the seller, as I mentioned earlier, has made a number of warranties in the SPA, and these warranties are important from the purchaser's perspective, because the purchaser has decided to pay the consideration and the purchase price over to the seller based on certain warranties. Now, if these warranties, which are statements of fact, turn out to be untrue, then the purchaser has paid above and beyond what it should have paid in the purchaser's view. So the purchaser will then look to raise a claim against the sellers. And the claim against the sellers is what we typically refer to in the legal industry as damages, where the amount of loss caused by the statement being untrue is quantified, usually by a court if it gets to a dispute perspective. And if the purchaser has made a justified claim that the warranty has in fact been breached by the seller, then the purchaser might get compensation back in a court of law. Now, this is where the disclosure letter pops its head in. And also, like I actually mentioned earlier, the shield, because that's sort of the concept sellers want to use when they are pretty much brought under the gun of potential claim. They'll look to the disclosure letter and say to the buyer, well, you're claiming for breach of an accounting warranty, as an example, but you will see here in our specific disclosures, we disclose against that warranty and state why we feel that warranty is slightly not untrue, but there's a different take on that warranty.
Qualified.
So it's qualifying. So we're qualifying the warranty, and the purchaser has looked at the disclosure letter and got comfortable. Okay, no, I can see that warranty is qualified, but I'm still, as a purchaser, willing to go ahead with the transaction. And if the seller, in due course, gets sued for breach of that warranty, the seller can say to the purchaser, I've disclosed against it, it's qualified, and hopefully that's the end of the story. So that's really what the disclosure letter is there to do. It's a process which takes time to cobble together. Usually it's the last thing you do in a transaction on the 11th hour, when the purchaser's deal team and the seller's deal team are really wanting to close, but they just haven't had time to sort of do the proper disclosure exercise, where basically the seller will sit down with the seller's lawyers and they'll go through every single warranty in the SPA which has now been negotiated, and they will disclose against certain warranties with their qualifications. And if the purchaser is happy with their qualification, they will tick the box and move to the next.
Is it a red flag if a seller has disclosure points for each of the warranties listed in the SPA?
It would be. Then the disclosure
Right?
letter doesn't have any purpose at all.
Because I've given so many warranties and then I'm disclosing against all of that. That means I'm just Making all of them redundant.
Correct. So there is a sensible sort of risk allocation
Okay.
between purchaser and seller, and usually what the warranties and the disclosure letter are very good at doing is flushing out information.
Okay, got it.
So I would see the warranties and the disclosure letter. Okay, it gives the purchaser some ammunition for a claim in the future, but that's sort of post the completion event of the transaction. The warranties and disclosure letter are in fact there to flush out more information so that the purchaser can make an informed view that it's willing to take the risk based on the disclosures.
Got it.
The seller will often try to disclose the entirety of the data room. So anything that's in the data room, it's disclosed. And when you've got a data room with hundreds of documents, you can't read every footnote and everything, right? So buyers, and certainly buyers' lawyers, will always, oh no, we can't disclose all of that. And the seller will say, well, you've seen everything. The point of this is if you've seen it, you're aware, so you can't sue me for it. So there's often a fun conversation that has around that particular disclosure.
Yeah, for sure there is. And it depends on who I'm acting for on the day. If I'm the buyer, I would never accept disclosure of the data room.
Okay.
If I'm the seller, I want to try and accept the disclosure of the data room. But I should also caveat that by the fact these days, disclosure and the use of virtual data rooms are becoming very, very sophisticated.
Mm-hmm.
So if both the buyer and seller have been following a sensible transaction timetable and the documents are populated in a correct way, as a buyer, you will, on a case-by-case basis, make the judgment call whether or not you will accept disclosure of the data room.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So I could, as a bad actor, theoretically share an Excel file in the data room with projections for the year and have a hidden tab or a hidden sheet, right, with disclosures saying that, oh, we might not be able to hit this because we might lose ABC customer, potentially.
Yeah.
Share that in the data room and say, look, I've disclosed the data room, so you have access to all of that.
Yeah.
And have it as part of the SPA. And if the buyer signs that document...
Yeah, look, now we're getting into a territory of the definition of disclosure,
Right.
which is the key topic. A sort of cliff note or a tab included in financials would probably not hit the definition of what we would term as fair disclosure.
Okay.
So if it's got a real material impact on the transaction and the seller is trying to be sneaky and sort of slotting it in under a document, then if the purchase is done as homework correctly and the lawyers are on their game, they will have defined what fair disclosure is in the SPA, which would negate that fact. But that's a good point, and that's
actually it happened very recently with a biotech company that had released some phase 2 or phase 3 results of one of the drug trials it was doing, and they had forgotten to remove the hidden sheets. And so when they shared it with all the equity analysts, one of them was able to pick it out and figured out that the data wasn't as good as the company had sold it.
Sure.
And then the stock price just cratered because of that. And so that's where I was coming from with that question.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Billing arrangements, right? I remember as in my days sitting as a lawyer, difficult conversation. Clients are rightly wanting more certainty on billing. I know we see it a lot that clients want to move to a more certain fee structure so that they're not worried about billable hours. And in fact, billable hours and that uncertainty is one of the reasons we often get from potential transaction parties that they want to use a more affordable lawyer or do away with the lawyer altogether because you know what? There's ChatGPT, so why do I need any lawyer anymore? Are you seeing that as well? And, how are you guys kind of managing this whole flexible billing arrangements and so on, especially in corporate work?
Look, I'd say clients are becoming much more, I would say, savvy in terms of their requests from the lawyers when it comes to the commercial/financial proposal which the lawyers are providing for their services. we're seeing a lot more requests for capped fees, which we are very happy to provide, but we'll also need to caveat those capped fees with a range of assumptions, so that there is a fair balance between risk and reward, between the lawyer on the one hand and the client on the other. And at CMS, we do actually offer a range of different billing alternatives, depending on the risk appetite of the client as well. But to answer your question, actually, in a nutshell, I think the days of lawyers just coming in the morning and clicking start on their timers,
The glory days.
and ending at 8 p.m. and shutting the timer down and billing all their time without any caps are quite numbered, particularly in the corporate transactional sphere. But having said that, there are certain situations where arguably the deals are so complex and the timing parameters and the requirements from the clients are so demanding that sometimes it makes sense to have fees billed by the hour. But I'd say they're probably a minority. And when I say billed by the hour, uncapped billed by the hour, I'd say so.
We are in I think, inflection point for all businesses and all industries. Obviously, I'm referring to AI, the onset of AI, and it is learning and improving at an exponential rate. I see it as the great equalizer. Countries that today are maybe considered less advanced and developed than their counterparts in the West, I think are also seeing that as, right, with the onset of AI, if we can be early and first adopters and really put money and resources and energy behind this, we could leapfrog and jump decades ahead of where we are today. In the context of the law and the business of law, what are you seeing, and what are you guys excited about, concerned about? How do you think the legal profession and the work of lawyers is going to change? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot in there, and it's in fact, I think it's actually probably the most interesting topic
sure.
that lawyers are talking about today, certainly more in disclosure letters.
Agreed.
I'd really like to hear your insight, because you're obviously at the cutting edge of this, and I'm sure it's discussed a lot.
It's, it is definitely discussed a lot, and every single large law firm is, at the moment, sort of future-proofing or strategizing of the future to come, which is pretty much already here now. It's daunting. I don't think any of us in our industry have an answer yet. What I can say is that it's going to revolutionize our business model. What you'll be finding is the advances of technology, which we're sort of, I wouldn't call it, well, we're testing them at the moment. The likes of large language models from Microsoft, large language models from other service providers, specifically in the legal industry. I won't mention any names, but they are fantastic products, and I'm lucky enough to get to use them now in my day job as we test products to roll out to the larger firm. What I would say is that everything I did from qualification and for the first 10 years can literally be done by a AI large language model, which is pretty scary, because I sit here today after having done those 10 years, and it's given me the tools I need to work today. So if you bring in these tools, which we're seeing now, it is going to eradicate the need for juniors. So how do we equip our juniors for the future when they haven't learnt on the job? Law is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And it's a skill how we develop, how we analyze our problems, how we solve problems. And this can, to a certain extent now, be undertaken by a chatbot. So what we're seeing slowly are some of our clients in their RFPs asking us, to what extent do you embrace AI, and how are you going to bring AI into the RFP, and how are you going to make the costs of your services lower?
Wow.
Very cheeky.
And I suppose the comeback from us is that we become a lot more productive. We can answer your questions much quicker, which hopefully provides you with a better service, and you can make commercial decisions quicker. But you got to remember, the licensing fees for these products are not cheap. So there has to be sort of a give and take. It's not going to mean that we can just drop our rates and sort of rely heavily on AI. AI comes at a cost, and I think a lot of people forget about that. But it's exciting, and as a lawyer, touching his 50s, soon there for you as well, actually.
A few years behind you, Patrik.
We
but
are-
yes, not far.
We need to develop. We need to be flexible. We need to understand and embrace the change, and that's what we're doing at CMS as a firm. We're excited about the problem, and we have ways of solving the problem, and that's a collective. But I can't tell you now, what does 10 years from now look like. I don't know. But it's an exciting journey, and we'll see where we get to.
Yeah, I think no one knows where it's going to go. I foresee, and again, I could be totally wrong. I foresee perhaps less impact on your practice area. And when I say yours, I mean, the likes of CMS and some of the large international, firms who are dealing with more complex transactions. What I do see, though, is certainly in the SME space or in the simpler space, I see the single human lawyer large practice, where you have a lawyer with experience who utilizes the power of AI behind him. And there's this whole sort of chat that's kind of in the sort of tech space today of the first single person unicorn, right? So the first one man or woman AI supported $1 billion
provider.
entity.
Wow. Yeah.
Now, I don't think that'll happen as a law firm, because $1 billion in legal fee is outrageous. I think other than Patrik, there are probably no lawyers that have achieved it. But I think there's scope for that, where you have a lot of small practices who can now benefit and leverage the power of AI. And I think it's actually a good thing for the end user, because hopefully you'll also up the quality of legal services that are available to SMEs, which, we see it all the time. There's a huge gap in that space. But exciting, and a space that I'm sure certainly we, as in the legal community, those around the business sort of legal, the business of law, are going to be watching closely.
No, agreed.
So it's not powered by AI, but augmented by AI.
There we go. That's a nice catchphrase. Yeah. But look, I think ultimately we're going to become much more productive as service providers. And I can see that already now by testing the products we are lucky enough to be testing at CMS. How a task which would have taken me 2 hours, I can probably fine tune down to about 20 minutes. So so that means my time, I still have to bill an hour of time, call it an hour of time for each hour of the day, but I can do many, many more tasks in that hour. I can service maybe 3 or 4 clients as opposed to one in that hour. So the benefit to the client will increase, because the costs will decrease slightly on the client's perspective, so that they're happy. But we as lawyers will probably be taking more and more.
So each individual client will maybe pay less, but you'll be taking on more clients because of productivity gains.
That could be a scenario.
But aren't you seeing even these large language models have a lot of hallucinations and not be able to deal effectively with outlier use cases, right?
Yeah.
Right? When you're operating in the middle of the spectrum, it's easier because there's a lot of data and documentation that they can crunch and, have the right output. But the sooner when you go to the left or the right of the spectrum and there are outlier use cases, they start giving the wrong answer.
Correct. And hallucinations are one of the biggest issues
Right.
with LLM models. What sort of touching on Akshay's question earlier with respect to where's the industry heading, maybe our junior lawyers will just be excellent at prompting, knowing what prompt to use. And you've got to remember the LLM models, they are learning every day.
Right.
So I think you'll probably get a situation where these outliers, as you expressed, will probably get less and less. But the hallucination is the most daunting aspect of the models, because when you read what the model produces, oh wow, this is so clear and so easy to follow. But you have to sort of strength test it. And I suppose that's where you need a legal mind to be able to verify what is being produced. So a very good example is you get a question as a lawyer and you might use a prompt and see what the LLM model spits out. And thereafter you look at it and go, oh, well, that's an interesting view. And then you go off and do independent research just to verify, the points of law that have been brought up. And it will probably have saved you a lot of time, but you probably don't have the whole answer. It will require some extra prompting and individual research. But at least it's given you the ability to be a bit more productive, get the job done quicker. And I'm afraid that clients are becoming more and more time conscious. They want things done immediately.
Right.
I remember the days in a fax machine room on Cannon Street. Actually, not Cannon Street, Liverpool Street, in one of the firms I trained with. And these days we're on email, we're on WhatsApp, we're on Teams, and clients expect a quicker response, which is both good and bad.
So I don't think it's right for us to be relying too much on these LLMs currently, right? With their hallucinations and inability to deal with outlier use cases, and especially when money is involved, right? I mean, you and I see a lot of deals in the 30, 40, 50, 60 million dirham valuation ranges that would do very well with having a seasoned lawyer, such as you, Patrik, on their side to be able to review the documents and provide the right legal advice for those documentations so that they can effectively structure the deal that benefits them as well as the other party. I'm sure you would be seeing a lot of clients come to you and say, hey, I can just use ChatGPT for my legal documentation, right? How do you respond to that?
Look, I think, as I mentioned earlier, that there is definitely a place in our service spectrum to use LLMs when we're advising clients. But ultimately, an LLM is only as good as the human behind the LLM giving the prompts. So if we just sort of park the LLM model for a while and just look at the sort of the value add which a human can bring to the table. I suppose the value adds are being present in a room between a buyer and seller, reading off the room, reading off the body language, reading off how the transaction parties are interacting in order to try and facilitate an outcome where both the buyer and the seller walk away feeling like winners. Right. A robot or a prompt or an LLM model can't do that. Let's not forget that ultimately the business of law is a service provided by humans with a human touch.
Right.
And you need that ability to get deals done in the 11th hour when you rely on someone who's seen the same type of issue either on the buy side or on the sell side occur time and time again. And if that person is myself and I don't have the answer, I will have that answer within 24 hours throughout my network. A specialist who has done widgets in Cambodia who knows the product liability of the current regime. I will have that information, and that's something you lean on in times of tough. Humans, people, lean on advice of other humans and people in order to get things done.
Yeah.
So artificial intelligence is great, but it's still no match for human intelligence.
Human intelligence given by Patrik Daintry at CMS. Is the way forward.
He's the man.
Look, I want to jump in on this at the end, I think, to close out. Bidzi is a startup, and I think one thing that we keep pushing and keep saying to all of our clients that get good quality legal advice.
Absolutely.
And, Patrick, there's the obvious, of course, a firm of your, gravitas, expertise isn't going to be cheap. But I think there's more important than the word cheap or expensive is the word value. And, are there ways that some of our potential buyers and sellers, and again, not the smaller side, but maybe the larger size deals in the high tens of millions of dirhams, 40, 50, 60 million dirhams, could they avail your expertise, and how would that happen if they can't necessarily, if they don't potentially have the budget for a full-blown diligence, SPA, exercise? Could they still get assistance from you?
Sure they can. And sort of one of the ways we do interact with clients who have more restricted budgets is, for example, review the transaction documents. And we might just sort of strength test some of the rationale and reasons why the buyer has taken a certain position or the seller has taken a certain position, just very much as food for thought. Sort of bringing a sort of independent third-party view onto the table. It's always quite difficult to do that, stepping into a transaction when you haven't been privy to the emails and the negotiations, but it does afford a sense of just questioning and strength testing, which might actually open hopefully not a can of worms, but another thought for either the seller or the buyer to think about when they enter into the transaction. So that's probably where we can add value, which doesn't cost the client too much from a financial perspective. Yeah. And I think actually value is the key word here. We're all consumers in some shape or form. We all love buying products and services, but we want to ensure that what we pay for that product or service, there is a strong value attributed to it. Yep. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the conundrum in the service sector, is always trying to demonstrate value. Why our services or why a competitor's services are better in terms of nailing down the value proposition.
Well, I think on that note, Patrik Daintry, CMS MENA, thank you very much for being on. I think this has been an extremely educative podcast, and I think anyone that's got this far will have come away with a lot of great knowledge. So thanks for being on.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Asif. Thanks,
Thank
Akshay.
you.
Been a pleasure.